Now, countries in the Asia-Pacific are among the hardest hit by Trump's tariffs, and the region supplies much of the world's essentials for daily life. One solution being discussed at the spring meeting, interregional trade instead of reliance on the United States. Okay, for more insight into China's economy, let's bring in Yan Liang, Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. Always good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on our program.
Yeah, good to be with you, Sean.
Okay, talk about how U.S.-China trade tensions are playing out within the IMF, because as we heard, a lot of nations' economies are being pared back significantly, but China's not so much. Has it done something to try to, I don't want to say tariff-proof, but of course deal with this ahead of it?
Right. So I think this trade tensions, of course, it goes beyond U.S. and China because the U.S. triggered this tariff war and basically imposed now 10% of tariff all across the board with over 180, trading nations. And we also know that reciprocal tariff is still just on the pause, right, with the 90 days of pause. And so I think that just imposed great uncertainty in the global economy. So countries will suffer from not just a supply shock, but also demand shock. And also because, the trade negotiations are going on, we never know what will come out of that. So I think there's just so much uncertainty. And that's why, the IMF has downgraded the growth forecast for the global economy from 3.2% to 2.8%. Just put this in perspective, this is actually the lowest growth rate in the past 25 years,
wow.
Outside of, this pandemic years and outside of the global financial crises. So you're right, the U.S. actually will suffer the most because their downgrade was a whole 0.9 percentage points, whereas China is moderated because of the fiscal support and other policy support that will help to cushion against this tariff war. But I think for developing countries, low-income countries, this is really an acute hit to the economy. It's a time when they need to fight climate change, they need to grow the economy to reduce poverty, they need to deal with the debt crises, and yet, the low-income countries' growth is downgraded to 4.2% as the previous 4.6%.
So how has China's influence within the institution evolved? Because just a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, the government said that Beijing is conducting itself as a responsible superpower. Your take on that?
Well, I think, first of all, we know that China has been a very active participant. It has been giving a lot of voluntary contributions to the IMF. And, for example, one of the important ones, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which basically help countries to deal with climate change. And China, as the single largest volunteer contributor to that fund, basically contributed over $7 billion. On the other hand, the United States is basically denying that IMF has anything to do with climate change, as you hear from Besant's speech, right? So I think, for one, China is a major contributor in terms of financing. And also, in addition to the IMF, China itself has been a very important bilateral lender to many countries, and also lend to other countries through many of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks like AIIB and NDB. So I think the financing power that China is helping the rest of the world is very notable. And second, I think China has been advocating for reforms to elevate the developing countries' voice, right? Developing countries account for 60% of the global GDP, but at IMF, they only have 40% of the voting rights.
Yeah.
U.S. alone has 16%. So I think, China is playing a role to try to reform these kind of Bretton Woods institutions to make it more just and more fair.
Well, let's pick up on that about China's voting power compared to other leading economies. Now, for a couple of years, China has been pushing for more influence, and that's something that has received positive response from the top of the agency.
Yes, you're right. And I think, anyone could see, that the numbers, the quota and the voting rights simply are not aligned with China's economic prowess, its openness, and its role in the global economy. China accounts for 18% of the global GDP, but it only has 6.08% of the voting shares at the IMF, behind the United States, right, which alone has 16.49, which basically gives the U.S. the veto power. And it's also behind Japan. Japan actually has 6.14% of the voting share. So I think this quota simply does not make sense. And I think the IMF has been talking about quota reform. They actually are they're due to have a quota reform sort of examination by June this year. So we need to reform the formula. We need to apply the formula in a more accurate way, and that would help to elevate China, but also I think global South the voting shares. So again, when you look at BRICS countries compared to G7, again, the kind of voting share really does not match with their economic size and their share in the global economy.
Indeed. And China has also been able to make inroads in many countries, many regions around the world with its Belt and Road Initiative. How has that initiative influenced its positioning within the IMF framework? And remember, many countries believe that the BNR will saddle nations, developing nations, with debt. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that is absolutely false claim, and it has been debunked by many academia. So I think the IMF actually is in charge of macroeconomic stability. They usually lend to help countries that experience balance of payment emergencies. In recent years, they also start to lend more for poverty reduction and also climate resilience kinds of projects. Whereas China's BRI is mostly to provide long-term, patient capital and productive finance for countries to build the infrastructure, to build industrial parks, and to really elevate their industrial capacity. So I think in some ways, China helped to complement with IMF lending. And on the other hand, in the past 20 years, China actually lent about $240 billion worth of rescue loans. Again, to help countries to provide some liquidity to help with their debt distress. So I think in that sense, China is complementing the IMF, and its rescue lending is about 20% of the size of the IMF's lending in the past decade. And China's practices, I think, are, in my judgment, better because China's loan disbursement is much faster, and they also does not come with conditionalities, unlike the IMF likes to impose fiscal consolidation and other structural adjustment programs. So I think in that sense, China is helping many developing countries to cope with their balance payment problems, but more importantly, to help their development, infrastructure construction, and so on and so forth.
You always come loaded with facts and figures. Yan Liang, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you for having me, Sean.